The bullet tore through the saloon's wooden sign, sending splinters flying as Mason Drake ducked reflexively, his weathered hand instinctively reaching for the Colt revolver holstered at his side. It was 1875 in Provo, Utah territory. Another ordinary day for a man who'd spent 15 years avoiding roots and relationships with the same vigilance he used to avoid lead poisoning. "Damn it, Horace, you trying to kill me or just the letter O?" Mason called out, spotting the drunken prospector fumbling with his pistol across the dusty main street. "Sorry, Drake," Horace hollered back, his voice slurred. "Gun went off cleaning it." Mason shook his head, the momentary tension leaving his broad shoulders as he pushed through the bat-wing doors of the Lucky Spur. At 34, Mason had perfected the art of being alone. His tall frame and sun-hardened features often intimidated those who didn't know him, and he preferred it that way. The less people got close, the less chance of them seeing what haunted him. The saloon's familiar smells of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed bodies greeted him as he strode to his usual corner table back to the wall, eyes on the door. Precisely how he'd survived this long. "The usual, Mason?" Betsy, the aging barmaid, asked as she wiped her hands on her apron. "Much obliged," he nodded, removing his dust-covered hat to reveal dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. As Betsy placed the amber liquid before him, the saloon doors swung open again, bringing with them a gust of wind and something Provo hadn't seen in months, a woman who didn't work in the establishment. Conversation died as she stepped fully inside. Mason observed her with practiced detachment. She was slender but sturdy-looking, dressed practically in a high-necked blouse and dark traveling skirt that had seen better days. No fancy Eastern lady, this one. Her auburn hair was tied back in a simple knot, and she carried herself with a quiet confidence that suggested she wasn't easily rattled. "I'm looking for Sheriff Wilkins," she announced to the room, her voice clear and steady. Old Tom Johnson, the town's de facto greeter, stepped forward. "Sheriff's making his rounds, miss. Won't be back for an hour or so. Something we can help with?" The woman's green eyes scanned the room, briefly meeting Mason's before moving on. "I'll wait for him, thank you. My name is Abigail Reed. I've come to claim my brother's property." A ripple of murmurs spread through the saloon. Mason took a slow sip of his whiskey, not wanting to get involved but unable to stop his mind from making connections. There had only been one Reed in Provo that he knew of, young Jeremy Reed, who'd struck a modest silver claim last year before fever took him. "Jeremy Reed's place?" Tom asked, confirming Mason's suspicion. "That's 2 miles outside town. Not much there but a shack and a played-out mine." "It's still mine by law," she replied firmly. "I have the papers to prove it." Mason watched as she squared her shoulders, clearly prepared for argument. Something about her demeanor, principled but not naive, stirred an unwelcome feeling in his chest. Respect, maybe, or recognition of a kindred spirit who knew what it meant to stand alone. "Saloon ain't no place for a lady to wait," Betsy interjected, shooting disapproving glances at the men openly staring. "Come on, dear, you can wait in the hotel lobby across the way." Mason expected the woman Abigail to accept the offer. Instead, she pulled out a chair at the nearest empty table. "Thank you, but I'm fine here. I'd like a meal if you serve food and information about my brother's last days, if anyone's willing to share." The directness caught Mason off guard. Most women who came west either clung to Eastern sensibilities or adopted frontier brashness. This woman seemed to have found some middle ground, practical without being hard, dignified without being prissy. He drained his glass and signaled for another, determined to mind his business. Abigail Reed's troubles weren't his concern. Mason Drake had learned the hard way that other people's problems had a way of becoming his own if he didn't keep his distance. But as the afternoon wore on, he couldn't help overhearing the conversations at her table. One by one, Provo citizens stopped by to introduce themselves and share what they knew of Jeremy Reed. The young man had been well-liked, hard-working, honest, generous to a fault. His death had genuinely saddened the community. "He spoke of you often, Miss Reed," the blacksmith was saying. "Said his big sister was smarter than any schoolmaster and twice as tough." A ghost of a smile touched Abigail's lips. He exaggerated. Always did. Not about how you raised him after your parents passed, the blacksmith continued. Said he owed everything to you. Mason saw something flicker across her face. Grief, guilt, determination, all mixed together. He recognized that look. He'd seen it in his own mirror often enough. When Sheriff Wilkins finally arrived, Mason had finished his third whiskey and was contemplating a fourth. Against his better judgment, he found himself listening intently as Wilkins explained the situation to Abigail. The claim's legally yours, madam, no question, but there's not much value left in it, and it's isolated, too isolated for a woman alone. I'm not afraid of isolation, Sheriff, she replied, or hard work. Wilkins sighed. It's not just the work, Miss Reed. These parts can be dangerous. We've had trouble with bandits, claim jumpers. Your brother's place is too far from town for anyone to hear if you called for help. I appreciate your concern, but I've come too far to turn back now. Mason downed his whiskey, irritated with himself for caring what happened to this stranger. Still, he'd known Jeremy Reed slightly. The kid had saved his bacon once during a flash flood, refusing payment afterward. Mason didn't like owing debts, even to the dead. Before he could think better of it, he was on his feet and approaching their table. Sheriff's right, Miss Reed. That cabin's no place for anyone alone, let alone a woman. Her green eyes locked with his, challenging. And you are? Mason Drake. I knew your brother. Not well, but enough to say he was a good man. Thank you, Mr. Drake. Did you also know him well enough to make decisions about what his sister can handle? The sharpness of her retort almost made him smile. Almost. No, madam, but I know these mountains. Know what can happen to folks who underestimate them. Sheriff Wilkins seized the opening. Mason here's one of the best trackers in the territory, knows every trail and canyon for 50 miles. Mason shot the lawman a warning look, seeing where this was heading. Perhaps Mr. Drake would be willing to escort you to the property, Wilkins continued, ignoring Mason's glare. Show you around, help you assess the situation before you make any final decisions. I'm sure Mr. Drake has his own affairs to tend to, Abigail replied, studying Mason with those perceptive green eyes. He should have agreed and walked away. Instead, he heard himself say, I can spare a day. The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. Mason Drake didn't involve himself in other people's business. That was his first rule of survival. Yet here he was, volunteering to help this woman he'd just met. That's very kind, but it's not kindness, Miss Reed, he interrupted, needing to make that clear. Your brother helped me once. Consider this repaying a debt. Something in his tone must have convinced her. She nodded slowly. Very well. When can we leave? First light tomorrow. I'll meet you here. As Mason walked back to his table to settle his bill, he caught Sheriff Wilkins smirking. Not a word, he warned the older man. Didn't say anything, Wilkins replied, raising his hands innocently. Just thinking it's been a while since I've seen Mason Drake volunteer for anything involving another human being. Like I said, repaying a debt. Sure, the sheriff drawled, a debt. Mason ignored him, tossing coins on the bar before heading to the door. As he passed Abigail Reed's table, he tipped his hat slightly. Dawn, Miss Reed. Don't be late. I'm never late, Mr. Drake, she replied evenly. A habit my brother unfortunately never acquired. The small, unexpected reference to Jeremy's notorious tardiness caught Mason off guard, and a brief smile tugged at his lips before he could stop it. Quickly composing his features, he pushed through the bat-wing doors into the fading afternoon light. Walking toward his small cabin at the edge of town, Mason cursed himself for getting involved. One day, he promised himself, he'd show her the property, explain the dangers, then wash his hands of Abigail Reed and her problems. With any luck, she'd see reason and return east where she belonged. But as he prepared his gear for the morning ride, an unsettling thought nagged at him. He wasn't entirely sure he wanted her to leave. Dawn broke clear and cold over the Utah mountains as Mason led his sorrel gelding from the livery stable. The October air had a bite that promised winter wasn't far off, and he'd dressed accordingly in his heavy wool coat and leather gloves. To his mild surprise, Abigail Reed was already waiting outside the hotel, a small trunk at her feet. "Morning, Miss Reed," he greeted, tipping his hat. "Mr. Drake," she acknowledged, her breath fogging in the crisp air. She'd traded yesterday's travel-worn outfit for sturdy riding clothes, practical trousers beneath a split skirt, a warm jacket, and leather boots that had seen real use. Mason raised an eyebrow. "You ride, then?" "Since I was 6, she replied. "Father believed girls should be as capable as boys." "Progressive man." "Practical man. We had a farm in Pennsylvania. Everyone worked." Mason nodded, reassessing his assumptions. "Sheriff's arranged a mount for you. Bay mare at the livery, gentle but not stupid." "Thank you." She moved to pick up her trunk, but Mason reached it first. "I'll take that," he said, lifting it easily. For a moment she looked like she might object, but then simply nodded. "Thank you." They walked in silence to the livery where the bay mare waited, already saddled. Mason secured Abigail's trunk behind his own saddle, his stronger horse better suited to the extra weight, and watched as she checked the mare's girth and bit with practiced hands. "You weren't exaggerating about your experience," he observed. "I rarely exaggerate, Mr. Drake." "It wastes time." He found himself appreciating her straightforwardness. In his experience, most people wrapped simple truths in layers of unnecessary words. They set out as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, riding north out of Provo. The town quickly fell behind them as they followed the trail that snaked along the foothills, gradually climbing toward the higher country where Jeremy Reed had staked his claim. Abigail rode well, sitting her mount with a natural ease that spoke of long experience. She kept pace without complaint, and Mason found himself having to remind himself that she was an Eastern woman unaccustomed to Western hardships. "Your brother's place is about 2 hours' ride," he said, breaking the silence. "Terrain gets rougher toward the end." "I expected as much." Jeremy wrote that the location was challenging but rewarding. That was his way of saying it was difficult, but worth it. Mason nodded. The claim had potential early on. Silver showed promising enough, but the vein narrowed faster than he hoped. "He never mentioned that in his letters," Abigail said quietly. "Always wrote about how well things were going." "Most men don't like admitting failure to those they respect," Mason offered, then immediately wished he hadn't. Getting personal wasn't part of the plan. She glanced at him, those green eyes too perceptive for comfort. "And what about you, Mr. Drake? What brings a man with your skills to a small place like Provo?" "Nothing complicated. Good hunting, fewer people than larger settlements." "You prefer solitude?" "I find it simpler." "Simpler isn't always better." He gave her a measured look. "Isn't always worse, either." They rode in silence for a while, climbing steadily into pine-covered foothills. The trail narrowed, forcing them to ride single file in places. Mason took the lead, occasionally glancing back to ensure Abigail was managing the increasingly difficult terrain. Each time, he found her focused and capable, if showing signs of tiring. After nearly 2 hours, they rounded a bend in the trail, and Mason pulled his horse to a stop, waiting for Abigail to come alongside him. "There it is," he said, pointing to a small clearing ahead where a modest cabin stood beside the entrance to a mine cut into the mountainside. Abigail sat very still, taking in the sight of her brother's final home. The cabin was crude but solidly built, with a stone chimney and a small covered porch. A creek ran nearby, and the view of the valley below was spectacular. Despite the isolation, it wasn't hard to understand why Jeremy Reed had chosen this spot. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Mason nodded. Your brother had an eye for land. They rode into the clearing and dismounted. Mason helped Abigail down, surprised by how light she felt as his hand spanned her waist. He released her quickly, uncomfortable with the momentary contact. "Cabin's been empty for 3 months, he warned as they approached. "Might be critters inside." "I've dealt with critters before," she said, but allowed him to enter first, waiting on the porch as he checked each corner of the single-room structure. The cabin was simple but surprisingly well built. A bed stood in one corner, a small table and chairs in another. A cooking stove occupied the wall opposite the stone fireplace, and shelves lined the walls, holding books, tools, and personal items. A layer of dust covered everything, but otherwise, the place was in good order. "All clear," Mason called, and Abigail stepped inside. She moved slowly around the room, touching her brother's possessions with gentle hands. Mason felt suddenly intrusive, witnessing her private grief, and moved back toward the door. "I'll check the mine entrance. Make sure it's secure," he said. She nodded without looking at him, her attention fixed on a small photograph in a frame, likely her brother, maybe even with her in it. Outside, Mason examined the mine entrance. Jeremy had shored it up properly with timber supports, but 3 months of mountain weather had taken a toll. Nothing dangerous, but it would need work before winter if Abigail intended to stay, which he still hoped she wouldn't. When he returned to the cabin, he found her building a fire in the stove, her movements efficient and practiced. "Mine entrance is sound," he reported, "though it'll need maintenance before snow flies." "Thank you." She straightened, brushing dust from her hands. "I appreciate your showing me the way, Mr. Drake. I know this wasn't how you planned to spend your day." The words were a dismissal, he realized with surprise. She expected him to leave now that he'd fulfilled his obligation. "It's too late to head back to town today," he said, glancing at the sun's position. "We'd be riding in the dark for the last hour, not safe in this terrain." She looked skeptical. "We arrived earlier than you suggested we would. Surely there's time. Weather in these mountains changes fast. Clouds moving in from the west. Could be rain by mid-afternoon." Abigail moved to the window, studying the sky with a knowing eye. "Perhaps a slight chance," she conceded, "but I wouldn't want to impose further on your time." Mason struggled with his own conflicting impulses. The smart thing would be to leave now, put distance between himself and this woman who stirred unwelcome feelings of responsibility. But the thought of her alone in this isolated cabin, miles from help, with night approaching. "I'll sleep in the lean-to by the wood pile," he said firmly. "Head back at first light. You'll have the cabin to yourself." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Very well, but I insist on preparing a meal for us both. It's the least I can do for your trouble." "No trouble," he muttered, feeling increasingly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I'll tend to the horses." Outside, Mason took his time unsaddling the animals, setting up a picket line near the creek where they could graze. The physical labor helped clear his head, which had been uncomfortably full of Abigail Reed since their meeting the previous day. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was certainly beautiful in an understated way that spoke of substance rather than show. It was her self-possession, her clear-eyed assessment of situations, her lack of pretense. Mason had spent years keeping people at arm's length, becoming expert at detecting falsehood and manipulation. Abigail Reed displayed neither, and that, oddly enough, made her more dangerous to his peace of mind than any saloon girl's calculated charms. By the time he returned to the cabin with their saddlebags and her trunk, savory smells were emanating from inside. He found her at the stove, stirring something in an iron pot. "Found some of Jeremy's preserved vegetables and dried beef," she explained. "There's a root cellar out back that's surprisingly well stocked. Some potatoes and onions still good." Mason set her trunk near the bed and his saddlebags by the door. "Your brother was always prepared, said he learned it from his sister." A small smile touched her lips. "He remembered something I taught him then." "That's gratifying." She served the simple stew in 2 bowls she'd found and cleaned, accompanied by hard biscuits she'd warmed on the stovetop. They ate at the small table, the cabin growing dimmer as evening approached. "What will you do with this place?" Mason asked finally, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Abigail set down her spoon, considering. "I'm not certain yet. It depends partly on what I find here." "Find?" She met his gaze directly. "Jeremy wrote to me about a discovery he made, something valuable, but not in the mine. His last letter said he'd hidden it and would explain when I visited in the spring." Mason frowned. "What kind of discovery?" He didn't specify, but I know my brother. He wouldn't exaggerate something like that. And you came all this way based on a cryptic letter? I came all this way because my only remaining family died alone in a place I've never seen, she replied, a flash of emotion breaking through her composure. The discovery is secondary. Mason nodded, chastened. I didn't mean to imply otherwise. What about you, Mr. Drake? You said you knew my brother. How did you meet? Mason hesitated, then decided there was no harm in the truth. I was tracking a mountain lion that had been taking calves from a ranch south of here. Trail led me into a canyon when a flash flood hit. Your brother pulled me onto higher ground just before the water would have swept me away. That sounds like Jeremy, she said softly. Always in the right place at the right time for others? Just not for himself, Mason added grimly, then regretted it when pain crossed her face. I'm sorry. That was thoughtless. But honest, she acknowledged, and you're right. Jeremy always looked out for everyone but himself. She paused, studying him. You remind me of him, in some ways. Mason shifted uncomfortably. Don't know about that. Your brother was a better man than most. He was, she agreed, but not because he was perfect, because he tried to do right, even when it cost him. She stood, gathering their empty bowls. Thank you again for accompanying me, Mr. Drake. I know it wasn't what you planned for your day. Mason, he said abruptly, if we're sharing a campfire, so to speak, you might as well use my name. She smiled slightly. Mason, then? And I'm Abigail, not Miss Reed. He nodded, oddly pleased at the small intimacy of first names. I'll get some wood for the stove. Nights get cold up here. Outside, splitting logs in the fading light, Mason berated himself for staying. He should have insisted on returning to town, weather risk or not. One more night, he told himself. Then he'd head back to Provo and his solitary life, leaving Abigail Reed to whatever fate she chose for herself. But even as he thought it, he knew something had shifted. The careful distance he maintained from others had been breached, not dramatically, but significantly. Like water finding a crack in stone, Abigail had somehow slipped past his defenses with nothing more than her straightforward manner and quiet strength. When he returned with an armload of split wood, he found her examining a small journal she'd discovered among her brother's belongings. Find anything about this mysterious discovery? He asked, stacking the wood near the stove. Not yet, but there's a reference to grandmother's story that might be important. Our grandmother used to tell tales about Spanish gold hidden in these mountains. Mason raised an eyebrow. Every territory has those legends. None ever pan out. I know, she sighed, but Jeremy believed it enough to mention it here. She closed the journal. I'll continue looking tomorrow. As darkness fell completely, the small cabin grew intimate in the glow of the oil lamp Abigail had lit. Mason became acutely aware of how confined the space was, how long it had been since he'd shared such close quarters with anyone, let alone a woman. I'll head to the lean-to, he said, reaching for his bedroll. Give you privacy. That's hardly necessary, she objected. The temperature's dropping fast, you'll freeze out there. I've slept in worse conditions. I'm sure you have. But why do so when there's no need? She gestured to the bearskin rug before the fireplace. You can sleep there. I'll take the bed. We're both adults. Mason. He hesitated, torn between propriety and practicality. The lean-to was indeed likely to be bitterly cold, with gaps in the walls that would let in the mountain wind. If you're concerned about my reputation, there's no one here to witness anything improper, she added dryly, and I trust you're a gentleman. That decided him. He couldn't leave after she'd expressed such confidence in his character. Very well, but I'll be gone before dawn. Need to hunt something fresh for your breakfast before I head back to town. She looked surprised. You're leaving so early? You'll be fine here, he said, more gruffly than he intended. Cabin's solid, plenty of provisions. Trail back to town is clear enough if you decide not to stay. I see. Something in her tone made him look at her more closely. Was that disappointment? Well, I appreciate all you've done. They prepared for sleep in awkward silence, each acutely aware of the other's presence. Mason laid his bedroll on the bearskin rug, positioning himself between the door and the bed, a protective instinct he didn't examine too closely. Abigail took longer, moving around the small space, putting things in order before finally settling on the bed, still fully dressed except for her boots. "Good night, Mason," she said softly as she extinguished the lamp. "Night," he replied, staring up at the ceiling, listening to her breathing gradually slow and deepen as she drifted into sleep. Mason himself remained awake much longer, troubled by thoughts he'd long kept at bay. Being here in this cabin, with this woman, stirred memories of a time when he'd imagined a different life for himself, one with a home, family, connections. Before the war had shown him how quickly those things could be torn away, leaving nothing but grief and emptiness. Better to have nothing, to be nothing to anyone. That way, when the world inevitably took it all away again, there'd be nothing left to mourn. Yet in the darkness, listening to Abigail's steady breathing, that certainty felt less absolute than it had for years. Mason woke before dawn, as planned, his body accustomed to early rising. For a moment, he was disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, then memory returned. He turned his head toward the bed where Abigail still slept, her auburn hair spread across the pillow, her face softer in repose. Silently, he rose and gathered his things, preparing to slip away as promised. But as he reached for the door, a floorboard creaked beneath his weight. "Leaving without saying goodbye?" Abigail's voice came from behind him, sleep husky but alert. Mason turned, finding her sitting up in bed, watching him with those clear green eyes. "Thought it best not to wake you." "Best for whom, I wonder?" She swung her legs over the side of the bed. "At least let me make you coffee before you go." He should refuse, should insist on leaving immediately. Instead, he found himself nodding. Coffee would be welcome. She smiled, that small, reserved smile that affected him more than any saloon girl's practiced pout. "Good. And perhaps you'll reconsider hunting before you leave. The provisions here are adequate for now." "Sun's barely up. Perfect hunting time. And perfect time to search for whatever Jeremy might have hidden," she countered. "2 sets of eyes would make it go faster." Mason hesitated. The smart move was to leave now, before he became any more entangled in Abigail Reed's affairs. Yet the thought of her finding something valuable, possibly attracting attention from the wrong sort of people. "1 hour," he conceded. "We search for 1 hour, then I need to head back." Her smile widened slightly. "Agreed." They shared a simple breakfast of coffee and hard biscuits, then began systematically searching the cabin. Mason checked the floorboards for loose planks, while Abigail examined the stones of the fireplace, looking for any that might conceal a hiding place. "Jeremy was clever about hiding things even as a boy," she explained. "Once hid a wounded rabbit he was nursing back to health inside a hollowed-out book." "Resourceful," Mason commented, tapping another floorboard. "Nothing loose here." "Nothing in the fireplace either," she sighed, sitting back on her heels. "Perhaps it's outside somewhere." "That would make sense," Mason agreed. Keeping valuables in the cabin itself would be risky if someone broke in. They moved their search outside, examining the woodpile, the small root cellar, even the outhouse. An hour passed quickly with no success. "I should get going," Mason said finally, glancing at the sun's position. Abigail nodded, disappointment evident in her expression. "Of course. You've already been more than generous with your time." As they walked back toward the cabin, Mason found himself reluctant to leave, not just because of the unsolved mystery of Jeremy's discovery, but because of Abigail herself. Her company was comfortable, in a way he hadn't experienced in years. "I could come back tomorrow," he heard himself offer, "help you continue the search." Surprise and pleasure flickered across her face. "You would do that?" Mason shrugged, attempting casualness. "Got nothing pressing in town, and I'm curious now about what your brother found." "I would appreciate the help," she said simply. "And the company." Something warm unfurled in Mason's chest at her words, a feeling so long dormant he barely recognized it. I'll be back mid-morning then. As he saddled his gelding, Abigail stood nearby, her arms crossed against the morning chill. Is there anything you need from town? I could bring supplies tomorrow. She considered, then nodded. Coffee, if you wouldn't mind, and perhaps paper and pencil. I'd like to make an inventory of what's here. Consider it done. He mounted up, settling into the saddle. Bar the door when I'm gone. Don't open it for anyone you don't recognize. I'll be careful, she promised. Thank you, Mason. He tipped his hat, then turned his horse toward the trail back to Provo. As he rode, Mason tried to make sense of his own actions. One day had somehow become two, with no clear end in sight, yet he couldn't bring himself to regret it. For the first time in years, he was riding toward something, not away from it. The realization was both unsettling and strangely exhilarating. The ride back to Provo gave Mason too much time to think. With each mile, his certainty wavered. What was he doing, involving himself with Abigail Reed? She was educated, refined, despite her practical nature, clearly from a background far removed from his own hard-scrabble existence. Moreover, she'd eventually return east. Women like her didn't stay in places like this. By the time he reached town, he'd half convinced himself to send someone else to check on her tomorrow. Yet when he stepped into the general store to purchase the items she'd requested, he found himself selecting the best quality paper and pencils, not the cheapest. Planning to write your memoirs, Drake? Henry Billings, the storekeeper, asked with a raised eyebrow. Just some supplies, Mason muttered, and coffee, best you've got. Henry's eyebrows climbed higher. Must be important business. You usually buy whatever's cheapest. Mason ignored the comment, paying for his purchases before heading to the saloon. A drink would clear his head, help him think rationally about this situation. The Lucky Spur was quieter than usual, with only a few patrons scattered at tables. Mason took his usual corner spot, ordering whiskey from Betsy, who eyed him curiously. You made it back in one piece, I see, she commented. How's the Reed woman settling in? Fine, he answered curtly, hoping to discourage further questions. Betsy wasn't so easily deterred. Sheriff was surprised you volunteered to take her out there, said it was the first neighborly thing he'd seen from you in years. Mason scowled. Just repaying a debt to her brother. Must have been some debt, Betsy remarked, wiping down the table beside his, considering how you avoid getting involved in other folks' business like it's the plague. Before Mason could respond, the saloon doors swung open, admitting Sheriff Wilkins and another man Mason didn't recognize, a well-dressed stranger in a black coat that had seen little trail dust. Evening, Drake, Wilkins greeted, approaching with the stranger in tow. This here's Herbert Caldwell, looking for Abigail Reed. Told him you just got back from her brother's place. Mason assessed Caldwell with a tracker's eye for detail. The man was in his 40s, prosperous-looking, with manicured hands and a watch chain that probably cost more than most miners made in a year. His expression was pleasant enough, but something in his eyes set Mason's instincts on alert. Miss Reed mentioned she was expecting an associate, Caldwell said smoothly, extending a hand. I've come from Pennsylvania to assist with her brother's affairs. Mason didn't take the offered hand. She didn't mention expecting anyone. Caldwell's smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened slightly. Perhaps it slipped her mind. We've had a complicated relationship. I'm her late fiancé's business partner. This new information hit Mason with unexpected force. Late fiancé. Abigail had never mentioned being engaged. Miss Reed is at her brother's cabin, Sheriff Wilkins supplied when Mason remained silent. About 2 hours north of town. Excellent, Caldwell nodded. I'll set out first thing tomorrow. Trails are tricky if you don't know them, Mason said, an idea forming. Easy to get lost. I'm sure I can manage with directions, Caldwell replied confidently. Recent rainfalls made some sections unstable, Mason continued. Wouldn't want to risk it without a guide who knows the way. Sheriff Wilkins gave Mason a curious look. You offering to take him out there, Drake? No, Mason thought. He was angling to reach Abigail first, to warn her of this unexpected visitor. Something about Caldwell didn't sit right. Could do, he shrugged with feigned indifference. Heading back that way tomorrow anyway. Promised Miss Reed some supplies. That's very kind, Caldwell said, though his expression suggested he found it more suspicious than kind. What time shall we depart? 9, Mason replied, knowing it would give him time to ride out earlier if necessary. Meet at the livery stable. After Caldwell excused himself to arrange accommodations at the hotel, Sheriff Wilkins lingered at Mason's table. Never known you to volunteer as a guide twice in 2 days, he observed, especially not for city folks. Mason took a long sip of his whiskey. Miss Reed's brother saved my life. Least I can do is make sure she's not bothered by trouble. And you think Caldwell might be trouble? Don't know, but something doesn't feel right. Wilkins nodded slowly. Man did seem mighty interested in what might be at that cabin. Asked a lot of questions about the mine, whether Reed left anything valuable. Mason's suspicions deepened. Did he now? Said he had a financial interest in Reed's affairs, something about investments. I'll keep an eye on him, Mason promised, draining his glass. Make sure his intentions toward Miss Reed are honorable. The sheriff smiled knowingly. And your intentions, Drake? Those honorable too? Mason stood abruptly, dropping coins on the table. Miss Reed is a lady deserving of respect. That's all that matters. If you say so, Wilkins replied, still smiling. But I've known you 15 years, and I've never seen you take this much interest in anyone's welfare before. First time for everything, Mason muttered, collecting his purchases and heading for the door. See you tomorrow, Sheriff. Back in his small cabin, Mason packed provisions for an early departure, his mind racing. Who was Herbert Caldwell really, and what did he want with Abigail? If he truly was her late fiancé's business partner, why had she never mentioned expecting him? And what was this about investments in Jeremy Reed's affairs? None of it added up. And Mason Drake had survived as long as he had by trusting his instincts when things didn't add up. He would leave before dawn, he decided. Reach Abigail hours ahead of Caldwell and get answers. Then decide what to do about the smooth-talking Easterner, who, Mason was increasingly convinced, was hiding his true motives. As he lay down to sleep, Mason tried to ignore the uncomfortable realization that his concern for Abigail went beyond mere obligation to her brother's memory. In less than 2 days, she had somehow breached walls he'd spent years building, walls that had kept him safely isolated from the messy, painful complications of human connection. Tomorrow would show whether that breach would be his undoing. True to his plan, Mason was on the trail north well before sunrise, pushing his gelding harder than usual. The first pink light of dawn was just touching the eastern horizon as he navigated the familiar path, his mind focused on reaching Abigail before Caldwell could set out from town. He arrived at the cabin as the sun cleared the mountains, relieved to see smoke rising from the chimney. Abigail was already awake then. Good. She opened the door as he dismounted, surprise evident on her face. Mason, I wasn't expecting you until later. Change of plans, he said, securing his horse to the hitching post. We need to talk. Something in his tone alerted her. What's happened? Mason glanced around, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. Inside, if you don't mind. Once in the cabin, he noted approvingly that she'd continued organizing her brother's belongings. The small space looked more lived in already, with books arranged on shelves and the table cleared of dust and debris. A man arrived in Provo yesterday evening, Mason explained without preamble. Herbert Caldwell. Says he's your late fiancé's business partner. Abigail paled visibly, her hand going to her throat. Herbert is here? In Utah. So you do know him? Yes, she confirmed, her voice tight, though I never expected him to follow me all this way. He claims he's come to help with your brother's affairs, something about investments. Abigail's expression hardened. Of course he would say that. I take it that's not the truth? She sighed, gesturing for him to sit at the table while she poured coffee into 2 tin cups. It's complicated. Robert, my fiancé, died 2 years ago. He and Herbert were indeed business partners in a shipping venture in Philadelphia. And, Mason prompted, sensing there was much more to the story. And after Robert's death, Herbert became persistent in his attentions toward me. He proposed marriage less than a month after the funeral, claiming it was what Robert would have wanted. Mason's jaw tightened. But not what you wanted. No, she confirmed. I hardly knew the man beyond formal social interactions, and there was something about him that made me uneasy. She hesitated, then added, when I refused him, he became increasingly intrusive, showing up uninvited at my home, questioning my friends about my activities. Sounds like a man who doesn't take no for an answer. Precisely. She took a sip of coffee, her hand steadier now. When Jeremy wrote about his silver claim, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to distance myself from Philadelphia and Herbert's unwanted attention. And now he's followed you here, Mason concluded grimly. Question is, why? Provo's a long way from Philadelphia just to continue a courtship. Abigail met his gaze directly. I've been asking myself the same question. Herbert isn't the type to be motivated by genuine affection. There must be something else he wants. Jeremy's discovery, maybe? Mason suggested. Caldwell was asking the sheriff about valuable items your brother might have left. Surprise flickered across her face. How would he know about that? Jeremy only mentioned it to me in his last letter. Unless your brother wrote to others as well. It's possible, I suppose, she conceded. But why would Herbert care about some potential discovery in the Utah territory? His business interests are all in shipping and Eastern investments. Mason considered this, turning the coffee cup in his hands. When is Caldwell expecting to arrive here? You didn't tell him you were coming early? No, told him I'd guide him here at 9. Gives us a few hours head start. Abigail smiled slightly. That was clever. Thank you for the warning, Mason. I'll be prepared for his arrival. I'm staying, Mason stated firmly. Don't trust his intentions. She looked like she might protest, then nodded. I appreciate that, though I don't want to keep you from your own affairs. Nothing that can't wait, he assured her, surprised by how true it was. His solitary existence in Provo suddenly seemed far less important than ensuring Abigail's safety. Then perhaps we should use this time to continue searching for whatever Jeremy hid, she suggested. I'd rather find it before Herbert arrives, if possible. Mason agreed, and they spent the next hour examining every inch of the cabin's exterior. The search proved fruitless until Mason noticed something odd about the well structure. This stone here, he said, pointing to a large rock set into the well's circular wall. It's different from the others, newer. Abigail knelt beside him, examining the stone. You're right. The mortar around it looks fresher, too. Working carefully with tools from Jeremy's shed, they loosened the stone and removed it. Behind it was a small cavity containing an oilskin packet. Abigail's hands trembled slightly as she withdrew it. This must be it. They returned to the cabin, where she unwrapped the oilskin to reveal a leather-bound journal and a folded piece of parchment that looked considerably older than the book. It's a map, Mason observed as she unfolded the parchment. Old Spanish by the look of it. The map showed a section of mountains that Mason recognized as being not far from their current location. Various landmarks were noted in faded Spanish text, with one area marked with what appeared to be a crude drawing of a crown. Grandmother's story, Abigail breathed. This must be what Jeremy was referring to. She opened the journal next, leafing through pages of her brother's handwriting until she reached entries from the months before his death. Listen to this, she said, reading aloud. April 15th, 1875. Found the old Spanish marker exactly where grandmother's map indicated, the fallen pine forming a natural bridge across the ravine, just as described. Beneath it, signs of old excavation. Someone tried to dig here long ago but abandoned the effort. Tomorrow I'll bring proper tools. She turned the page, continuing. April 16th. Success beyond imagining. The legend was true. Spanish gold, hidden during their retreat from northern territories. Not a large quantity, but more than enough to change a man's fortunes. Must be cautious. Too many desperate men in these mountains. Mason listened intently, a growing sense of unease taking root. If Jeremy Reed had indeed found Spanish gold, it explained many things, including Herbert Caldwell's sudden interest in a remote cabin in Utah Territory. "Does he mention where he hid the gold?" he asked. Abigail scanned further entries. "Nothing specific. He writes about moving it to a safer location, but doesn't specify where." She looked up, troubled. "The last entry is from just 3 days before he fell ill with fever." "If Caldwell somehow learned about this discovery, it would explain his persistence," Mason observed. "Gold has a way of bringing out the worst in men." "But how would he know?" Abigail wondered. "Unless—" Her expression changed as realization dawned. "My letters. Herbert often visited my landlady, who sometimes took possession of my mail. He could have read Jeremy's letters to me." Mason's estimation of Caldwell's character sank even lower. A man who'd read another's private correspondence wouldn't hesitate at much worse. "No," she agreed grimly. "He wouldn't." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their discussion. Mason moved quickly to the window, surprised to see not one but 3 riders approaching. He recognized Caldwell in the lead, accompanied by 2 rough-looking men who definitely weren't from Provo. "Caldwell's early," he informed Abigail, "and he's brought friends." She joined him at the window, her expression hardening as she observed the newcomers. "Those men aren't business associates. They look more like hired guns." "That would be my assessment, too." Mason checked his revolver, ensuring it was fully loaded. "Stay inside. Let me handle this." "This is my property," she objected. "I won't hide while you face danger on my behalf." Mason wanted to argue but recognized the determination in her eyes. "Fine. But stay behind me, and if things go wrong, head for the trees. Don't hesitate." She nodded, squaring her shoulders as they stepped onto the porch to meet the unwelcome visitors. Caldwell's surprise at seeing Mason was poorly concealed beneath a veneer of civility. "Mr. Drake, I thought we had an arrangement to depart at 9. "Plans changed," Mason replied coolly. "Miss Reed needed her supplies earlier than expected." "How fortunate she has such a dedicated courier." Caldwell's gaze shifted to Abigail, his expression softening into what Mason recognized as a practiced smile. "Abigail, my dear, you're looking well, despite your rustic surroundings." "Herbert," she acknowledged stiffly. "This is unexpected. I don't recall inviting you to Utah Territory. When I learned of your brother's passing, I couldn't in good conscience allow you to face such difficulties alone," Caldwell replied smoothly. "Robert would have expected me to look after you." "Robert has been dead for 2 years, Abigail stated flatly, "and I am perfectly capable of managing my own affairs." Caldwell's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, but there are financial matters to consider, investments your brother made that require attention." "Jeremy never mentioned any business dealings with you," she countered. "In fact, he never mentioned you at all." The pretense of civility began to slip from Caldwell's expression. "Perhaps there were aspects of your brother's affairs he chose not to share with you." "Or perhaps," Mason interjected, "you're not here about business investments at all." Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "I don't believe this concerns you, Mr. Drake. When armed men show up at a lady's doorstep with false pretenses, it becomes my concern." The 2 men flanking Caldwell shifted in their saddles, hands moving subtly closer to their weapons. Mason tensed, ready to draw if necessary. "I assure you, my intentions are honorable," Caldwell insisted, though his tone had grown noticeably colder. "I simply wish to speak with Abigail privately about matters that don't concern outsiders." "That won't be possible," Abigail stated firmly. "Whatever you have to say can be said in front of Mr. Drake, or not at all." Anger flashed across Caldwell's features before he quickly composed himself. "Very well. To be direct, I have reason to believe your brother made a significant discovery before his untimely death, a discovery that, given my financial support of his earlier ventures, I have some claim to." "Financial support?" Abigail repeated incredulously. "Jeremy never received a cent from you." "No? How do you think he afforded passage west, equipment for his mining operation?" Caldwell smiled coldly. I advanced him considerable funds with the understanding that any significant discoveries would be shared. Mason watched the exchange carefully, noting how Caldwell's companions continued to position themselves advantageously. This wasn't going to end with conversation. The men had come prepared for confrontation. "Do you have documentation of these supposed investments?" Abigail challenged. "As a matter of fact, I do." Caldwell reached slowly into his coat, producing a folded document. "Your brother's signature, acknowledging a loan of $2,000, with terms clearly stated." Mason didn't need to see the paper to know it was likely forged. Jeremy Reed had been many things, but a fool about legal matters wasn't one of them, according to Abigail's own account of her brother. "May I see that?" Abigail requested, extending her hand. Caldwell hesitated, then passed the document to her. As she unfolded it, Mason kept his attention divided between the supposed businessman and his armed companions. Abigail studied the paper briefly, then looked up with cold fury in her eyes. "This is not my brother's signature. Jeremy always signed with a distinctive flourish on the J, something our father taught us both. This is a forgery, and not even a good one." Caldwell's facade cracked completely. "It doesn't matter. We know about the Spanish gold, Abigail. Your brother found it, and now it belongs to me." "You have no right," Abigail began, but Caldwell cut her off. "Rights have nothing to do with it. I've come too far and invested too much to leave empty-handed." He gestured to his companions. "These gentlemen will help us search the property thoroughly. I suggest you cooperate for your own safety." Mason had heard enough. His hand moved to his revolver as he stepped slightly forward, positioning himself more firmly between Abigail and the threat. "That's not happening, Caldwell. I suggest you and your friends turn around and head back to town." "Or what, Cowboy?" one of the hired guns sneered. "You're outnumbered." "Being outnumbered only matters if the odds are even to begin with," Mason replied evenly. "I've been watching you favor your right side since you rode up. Old injury makes you slow on the draw. Your friend there has been drinking since breakfast smelled it when the wind shifted." "And Caldwell?" He smiled coldly. "Caldwell's never fired a gun at anything that could shoot back." The confidence in Mason's voice created exactly the moment of doubt he'd hoped for. The hired guns exchanged glances, suddenly less certain of their advantage. Caldwell, however, wasn't so easily deterred. "This is absurd. We're having a business discussion, not a showdown." "Business discussions don't require armed escorts," Mason countered. "Now, I'll say it one more time. Leave." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Caldwell made a slight gesture to his companions, and one reached for his gun. Mason drew and fired in one fluid motion. The bullet struck the ground inches from the hired gun's horse, causing the animal to rear in panic. The man tumbled from his saddle, his weapon discharging harmlessly into the air as he fell. The second gunman froze, his hand halfway to his holster. "Next one won't miss," Mason promised, his revolver now trained steadily on Caldwell. "Your choice how this ends." Caldwell's face contorted with rage, but he clearly recognized the shift in circumstances. "This isn't over," he spat. "That gold belongs to me by right of investment, and I will have it." "The only thing you have a right to," Abigail said coldly, "is a jail cell for forgery and attempted theft. Now, get off my property before Mr. Drake decides his aim isn't what it used to be." The fallen gunman scrambled back onto his horse, visibly shaken. At Caldwell's reluctant nod, the three men turned their mounts and rode back down the trail toward town. Only when they were out of sight did Mason holster his weapon. "They'll be back," he said grimly. "Men like that don't give up easily when gold is involved." Abigail nodded, her face pale but composed. "What should we do?" "Find the gold first," Mason decided. Jeremy's journal mentioned an old Spanish marker near a fallen pine forming a natural bridge. I know these mountains well enough to have some idea where that might be. "And then?" "Then we get it somewhere safe, where Caldwell can't touch it." He turned to face her fully. "After that, it's your decision. Stay or go back east. But at least you'll be deciding on your own terms, not his." Something in Abigail's expression softened as she looked at him. "Thank you, Mason. Not just for this, but for believing me without question." "Some things you don't need proof for," he replied simply. "The kind of man who'd stalk a woman across half the country isn't the kind who deals honestly in anything else." They gathered supplies, quickly water, food, tools for digging, and weapons. Mason saddled both horses while Abigail secured the cabin as best she could. Within half an hour, they were riding deeper into the mountains, following the rough directions from Jeremy's journal. As they rode, Mason found himself watching Abigail with growing admiration. Most women, most people, period, would have been shaken to the core by the morning's confrontation. Yet, here she was, straight-backed in the saddle, eyes alert and focused on the task ahead. "Your brother mentioned a ravine with a fallen pine," Mason said as they navigated a particularly steep section of trail. "There's a place about an hour from here that fits that description. Old miners called it Dead Man's Cut because of how narrow and deep it runs." "Cheerful name," Abigail remarked dryly. "Western tradition," Mason replied with a small smile. "Name places for the worst thing that could happen there." "Is that how Provo got its name? Someone named Provo met a terrible end?" Mason chuckled despite the gravity of their situation. "Actually, it's named after a French-Canadian trapper, Etienne Provost, though I imagine he had his share of close calls." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Mason found himself contemplating how quickly his solitary existence had been upended. 3 days ago, his biggest concern had been whether to track that mountain lion again or focus on stocking up for winter. Now, he was guiding a remarkable woman through dangerous territory, evading armed men, and searching for Spanish gold, all while trying to ignore the growing warmth he felt in her presence. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they climbed higher into the mountains. Pine forests gave way to rocky outcroppings, offering spectacular views of the valley below, but making travel slower and more treacherous. "It should be just ahead," Mason said finally, as they rounded a bend in the narrow trail. "Dead Man's Cut runs east to west through that ridge." They dismounted at the edge of a steep drop-off, securing the horses to sturdy pines. Approaching the edge cautiously, they found themselves looking down into a deep, narrow ravine, perhaps 30 feet deep and no more than 15 across at its widest point. "There," Abigail pointed, her voice hushed with excitement. "The fallen pine." Sure enough, a massive pine had toppled across the ravine, its massive trunk forming a natural bridge from one side to the other. Years of exposure had stripped away branches and bark, leaving it smooth and gray against the rugged rock walls. "Jeremy's journal mentioned signs of excavation beneath the tree," Abigail recalled. "We'll need to get down there." Mason studied the ravine's sides carefully. "There's a way down on the far side. See that natural stair-step formation in the rock? We can cross over the log and descend there." Abigail eyed the fallen pine with understandable apprehension. "I suppose crossing that is our only option?" "I'll go first," Mason offered. "Test its stability." The massive trunk, while weathered, proved solid beneath his weight. He crossed carefully, then turned to offer guidance. "Keep your eyes forward, not down. Move steadily, but don't rush." Abigail took a deep breath, then stepped onto the natural bridge. Her progress was slow but determined, her focus absolute as she placed one foot carefully in front of the other. When she reached the midpoint, a sudden gust of wind swept through the ravine, and she momentarily lost her balance. Mason's heart lurched as he saw her waver. "Eyes on me," he called steadily. "Just keep looking at me and walking forward." Their gazes locked, and something passed between them, trust perhaps, or something deeper. Abigail regained her composure and continued forward until she reached the safety of solid ground beside him. "Well done," he said softly, resisting the sudden urge to pull her into his arms. "Thank you," she replied, slightly breathless. "I'm not typically afraid of heights, but that was challenging. They made their way carefully down the rocky staircase to the floor of the ravine. Here, in the shadow of the ravine walls and the fallen pine above, the air was noticeably cooler and carried the scent of damp stone and earth. "Look," Abigail said, pointing to an area directly beneath the fallen tree. "The ground has been disturbed." Mason knelt to examine the site. Unlike the surrounding earth, which was hard-packed and rocky, this section showed signs of having been dug up and refilled. Recent rains had settled the soil somewhat, but the difference was clear to an experienced eye. "Someone definitely excavated here," he confirmed, "recently enough that vegetation hasn't reclaimed it yet." "Jeremy," Abigail breathed, "this must be where he found the Spanish gold initially." They began to dig carefully, using the tools they'd brought. The earth was rocky, but yielded relatively easily to their efforts. About 2 feet down, Mason's tool struck something solid. "Hold on," he said, setting aside the small shovel to excavate by hand. Brushing away dirt, he revealed a flat stone with markings carved into its surface. "Spanish," Abigail confirmed, leaning closer to examine the weathered inscription. "It says, 'El tesoro de Dios está protegido.' The treasure of God is protected." Religious significance? Mason wondered. Possibly. Or a warning. She brushed more dirt from around the stone's edges. "Help me lift this." Together, they removed the carved stone, revealing a small, empty cavity beneath. "Empty," Mason observed unnecessarily. "Your brother must have removed whatever was here." Abigail sat back on her heels, disappointment evident in her expression. "So we're back where we started. Jeremy found the gold here but moved it to a safer location that he never specified." Mason studied their surroundings more carefully. "If I'd found something valuable and wanted to relocate it nearby, I'd look for natural landmarks that wouldn't change over time." "Like what?" "That formation there." He pointed to a distinctive rock outcropping on the ravine wall opposite their position. "Looks like a bear's head in profile. Easy to remember, easy to describe." Abigail followed his gaze, nodding slowly. "Yes, I see it. But there are dozens of such formations in these mountains." "True, but Jeremy was practical. He wouldn't move the gold far from its original location. Too risky carrying something valuable across open territory." They searched the ravine floor methodically, paying special attention to areas near distinctive rock formations. The sun had climbed high overhead by the time Mason noticed something promising, a pile of stones that appeared deliberately arranged rather than naturally placed. "Here," he called to Abigail, who had been examining another section of the ravine wall. "This looks man-made." The stones formed a small cairn about 3 feet high, positioned directly beneath a rock formation that resembled a crouching mountain lion. As they carefully dismantled the pile, they found what they'd been seeking: a small iron box, rusted but intact, hidden within the cairn center. Abigail's hands trembled slightly as she took the box from Mason. It was locked, but the lock was simple and yielded easily to Mason's knife. Inside, nestled in a scrap of wool cloth, lay a dozen small gold ingots bearing Spanish markings, along with a handful of gold coins. "Jeremy found it," Abigail whispered, touching one of the ingots reverently. After all these years, Grandmother's story was true. Mason examined one of the coins, noting its age and excellent condition. "This is genuine Spanish colonial gold, probably hidden during their retreat in the late 1700s. How much do you think it's worth?" "Hard to say exactly. The gold itself has significant value, but to collectors of historical artifacts, considerably more." He carefully rewrapped the treasure in the cloth. "Enough to give you options, certainly." Abigail looked up at him, her expression difficult to read. "Options," she repeated softly. "I haven't had many of those in recent years." The vulnerability in her voice stirred something protective in Mason's chest. Before he could respond, however, the sound of dislodged stones from above caught their attention. Someone was approaching the ravine. "Get behind me," Mason whispered, drawing his revolver as he scanned the rim of the ravine. Moments later, Herbert Caldwell's voice echoed down to them. I see you've found what we're looking for. How convenient. Mason spotted him standing at the edge of the ravine, near where they'd descended, one of his hired guns beside him. The second man was nowhere in sight, likely circling to cut off their potential escape route. "This doesn't belong to you, Caldwell," Mason called back, positioning himself to shield Abigail. "Never did." "On the contrary," Caldwell replied smoothly. "I have a legal claim to anything of value found by Jeremy Reed. Now, be reasonable. There's no way out of that ravine except past us. Hand over the gold, and we'll allow you both to leave unharmed." Mason assessed their situation rapidly. Caldwell was right about one thing: their position was vulnerable. The only exits from the ravine were the natural staircase they had used to descend, and a similar formation at the opposite end, both easily covered by armed men. "What's your plan?" Abigail whispered, clutching the iron box to her chest. "When I give the signal, run for that crevice in the wall," Mason instructed, nodding toward a narrow fissure in the ravine wall about 20 yards away. "It's not deep, but it'll give you cover. And you? I'll keep their attention." Abigail's eyes widened with concern. "That's too dangerous. They'll kill you." "They'll try," Mason corrected grimly. "I've faced worse odds." Before she could protest further, Mason called back to Caldwell. "Why don't you come down here and claim your property yourself? Or are you afraid to do your own dirty work?" "I'm a businessman, not a fool," Caldwell replied coldly. "My associates will handle the retrieval. Throw down your weapon, Drake, and this doesn't have to get messy." Instead of complying, Mason fired 2 quick shots at the ledge near Caldwell's feet, sending the man scrambling backward with a startled cry. "Now!" he hissed to Abigail, who sprinted for the crevice as instructed. The hired gun on the rim returned fire, his bullet striking stone near Mason's position, sending fragments flying. Mason fired again, forcing the gunman to take cover, then quickly relocated to a different position behind a boulder. "This is your last chance, Drake," Caldwell shouted, his voice tense with anger. "Surrender the gold, or neither of you leaves this ravine alive." Mason didn't bother responding. He'd spotted movement at the far end of the ravine, the second gunman, as expected, positioning himself to trap them. But the man had made a critical error, silhouetting himself against the sky momentarily. Taking careful aim, Mason fired. The distant figure jerked, then crumpled, tumbling partway down the ravine wall before coming to rest on a ledge. The remaining gunman unleashed a barrage of bullets, forcing Mason deeper into cover. He counted the shots 5, 6, 7, knowing the man would need to reload soon. When the firing paused, he risked a glance toward Abigail's position, relieved to see she remained safely concealed. "You're down a man, Caldwell," Mason called out, "and your remaining gun hand is almost out of ammunition. You sure you want to continue this fight?" A tense silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, a new voice joined the confrontation. "I reckon that's enough shooting for one day." Mason recognized Sheriff Wilkins's distinctive drawl immediately. Looking up, he saw the lawman standing on the ravine rim, his rifle trained on Caldwell. "These men are trespassing on private property, Sheriff," Caldwell protested. "We were merely defending ourselves." "Funny. That's not what it looked like from where I was watching," Wilkins replied dryly. "Looked more like you were trying to rob Miss Reed of something that belongs to her." "I have documentation proving my claim to save it for the judge," Wilkins interrupted. "Right now, you're dropping any weapons and coming with me." The hired gunman, seeing the shift in circumstances, wisely laid down his pistol. Caldwell, after a moment of visible calculation, surrendered as well. "This isn't over," he spat as Sheriff Wilkins bound his hands. "That gold doesn't belong to her." "Like I said, tell it to the judge." Wilkins peered down into the ravine. "You folks all right down there?" "We're fine, Sheriff," Mason called back, relief flooding through him. "How'd you know to come looking for us?" "Caldwell and his friends made quite a show of leaving town fully armed this morning. Got me suspicious, especially after our conversation yesterday." The sheriff secured his prisoners to their horses. "I'll take these 2 back to town. Meet you there when you're ready." As the sheriff departed with his prisoners, Mason hurried to the crevice where Abigail remained hidden. "It's safe now," he assured her, extending a hand to help her out. She emerged cautiously, still clutching the iron box. "That was too close," she breathed, her face pale but composed. "If the sheriff hadn't arrived when he did." "But he did," Mason said gently. "And we found what we came for." Abigail looked down at the box in her hands, then back up at Mason, her expression troubled. "A man was shot because of this. A man was shot because he chose to threaten innocent people for something that wasn't his," Mason corrected firmly. "That's not on you or this gold. It's on him and Caldwell." She nodded slowly, accepting his words. "What happens now?" "Now we get out of this ravine and back to town. Make formal statements to the sheriff about what happened here. After that," he hesitated, suddenly uncertain of his place in her future plans. "After that, you decide what you want to do with your treasure and your life." They made the climb out of the ravine in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The horses, thankfully, remained where they'd left them, undisturbed by the earlier gunfire. As they mounted up for the return journey, Abigail turned to Mason. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not just for helping find the gold, but for standing by me against Caldwell. You could have been killed." "Seemed worth the risk," he replied, surprising himself with his honesty. Something shifted in her eyes, a warmth, a question, perhaps both, but she simply nodded and turned her horse toward the trail back to Provo. They rode mostly in silence, the day's events weighing heavily on them both. As they neared town, however, Abigail spoke up. "I've been thinking about what to do next," she said, "with the gold, with the cabin, with everything." Mason kept his expression neutral, though his heart beat faster at her words. "And Jeremy loved that place, loved these mountains. I think he'd want me to keep it, even if just as a memory of him." She glanced at Mason, a question in her eyes. "What do you think?" "It's isolated," he said carefully. "Difficult to maintain alone." "Yes," she agreed. "It would be." Something in her tone made him look at her more closely. "Are you asking my opinion as a local or as someone I've come to trust?" she finished when he faltered. "As someone who, against all expectations, has become important to me in a very short time." Mason reined his horse to a stop, needing to face her properly for this conversation. Abigail halted beside him, those clear green eyes meeting his without hesitation. "I've spent 15 years avoiding attachments," he said finally, the words difficult but necessary. "After the war, after losing everyone who mattered, it seemed safer that way." "And now?" she asked softly. "Now I'm not so sure." He took a deep breath, forcing himself to continue. "Meeting you has made me question things I thought were settled, made me wonder if alone is really safer or just emptier." A small smile touched her lips. "I came west to escape one man's unwanted attention, only to find myself hoping very much for another man's regard." The simple honesty of her words struck Mason deeply. "You have it," he assured her, "more than I thought I was still capable of giving." "Then perhaps," she suggested, her voice gentle but certain, "you don't have to die alone after all, Mason Drake." The echo of his own long-held conviction that solitude was his inevitable fate in her words startled him. Had he spoken that belief aloud to her? No, but somehow she had seen through to the core of him anyway. "No," he agreed, reaching out to take her hand. "Perhaps I don't." The remainder of their journey to Provo passed in a different kind of silence, one filled with possibility rather than uncertainty. At the sheriff's office, they made their statements about the events at the ravine, learning that Caldwell and his surviving hired gun would be held for attempted robbery and assault. "The gold's rightfully yours, Miss Reed," Sheriff Wilkins confirmed after examining the Spanish coins. "As for its value, well, you might want to consult someone with expertise before making any decisions." "I plan to," she assured him, "but first, I need to decide where my future lies." Her gaze met Mason's briefly, and the sheriff's knowing smile suggested he wasn't blind to the connection forming between them. "Well, wherever that future takes you," Wilkins said, "I suspect it'll be brighter with that Spanish gold funding it." After leaving the sheriff's office, they walked slowly toward the hotel where Abigail would stay the night. The iron box, now secured in a larger wooden chest borrowed from the sheriff, remained in her possession. "Will you stay in Provo?" Mason asked as they reached the hotel's entrance. "For now," she replied. "I need to properly assess my brother's affairs, decide what to do with the cabin and the mine claim." She hesitated, then added, "And there are other considerations keeping me here as well." The warmth in her eyes left little doubt about her meaning. Mason felt something long dormant unfurl in his chest. Hope, perhaps, or the beginnings of joy. "I'd like to help," he offered, "with the cabin, the claim, whatever you need." "I'd like that," she smiled. "Though I warn you, I'm quite capable of handling things myself." "I never doubted it for a moment," he assured her, smiling back. "It's one of the things I admire most about you." They stood there for a moment, poised on the threshold of something neither had expected to find in this remote corner of Utah territory. "Mason," Abigail said finally, her voice soft but steady, "I don't know what the future holds, but I do know I don't want to face it alone anymore. Not if I don't have to." In her words, he heard the echo of his own unspoken fear, the fear that had driven him to isolation for so many years, the fear of loss, of vulnerability, of caring too deeply. But he also heard the promise of something he'd never thought to find again: connection, understanding, possibility. "You don't have to," he told her, his voice rough with emotion as he took her hand in his. "Neither of us does." The months that followed transformed Mason Drake's life in ways he could never have anticipated. The cabin that had once belonged to Jeremy Reed became a joint project, with Mason and Abigail working side by side to expand and improve it. The Spanish gold, carefully invested, provided security without ostentation, exactly as Abigail wished. Herbert Caldwell was sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison for attempted robbery and forgery. His testimony revealed that he had indeed intercepted Jeremy's letters to Abigail, learning of the Spanish treasure and pursuing her across the country to claim it for himself. Mason and Abigail were married the following spring in a simple ceremony in Provo, with Sheriff Wilkins standing as witness. By then, the town had grown accustomed to seeing the once solitary tracker in the company of the educated Easterner, their unlikely partnership a source of gentle speculation and eventual acceptance. They divided their time between the cabin in the mountains and a small house on the edge of Provo that Mason had purchased with his savings. Abigail established a small school for the children of miners and ranchers, while Mason continued his work as a tracker and guide, though he no longer accepted jobs that would take him far from home for extended periods. On their first anniversary, sitting on the porch of the mountain cabin watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant hues, Abigail presented Mason with a gift, a journal bound in soft leather. "What's this for?" he asked, turning the blank book in his hands. "For your stories," she replied, leaning against his shoulder. "The ones you tell me about these mountains, about the people and places you've known. They deserve to be preserved." Mason had never considered his experiences worth recording, but Abigail's belief in their value touched him deeply. "I'm not much of a writer," he demurred. "You're a wonderful storyteller," she countered. "The writing will come with practice." He smiled, tucking the journal safely aside before drawing her closer. "I'll try, for you." "No," she corrected gently. "For us. For the family we're building. For the future." Her hand drifted to her midsection, where the first subtle signs of their child had begun to show. Mason covered her hand with his, marveling at how completely his life had changed in less than a year. "When I first met you," he said softly, "I was convinced I'd die alone, had accepted it as inevitable. And now?" she prompted, turning to face him. "Now I know better," he answered, his voice thick with emotion. "Now I know that some risks are worth taking, some walls worth breaking down." As the last light faded from the sky, Mason Drake held his wife close, grateful beyond words for the woman who had shown him that the future he'd feared for so long could instead be filled with purpose, connection, and love. The solitude he'd once clung to as protection now seemed a poor substitute for the rich, complex reality of sharing his life with someone who understood him completely. Together, they watched darkness settle over the mountains, unafraid of what tomorrow might bring. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced all others since that fateful day in the lucky spur, side by side, stronger together than either had ever been alone. In the years that followed, Mason's journal filled with stories not just of the past but of the present too. The birth of their son, Michael, followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Emily. The expansion of Abigail's school as Provo grew from frontier settlement to proper town. The transformation of Jeremy's modest mining claim into a profitable venture when a new silver vein was discovered in a previously unexplored section. But of all the stories Mason recorded, his favorite remained the simplest: how a man determined to live and die alone found unexpected redemption in 4 words spoken by a brave, green-eyed woman who saw past his carefully constructed walls to the heart still capable of love beneath. "You don't have to." Words that had changed everything. Words that had given him the courage to reach for happiness he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve. Words that had brought him home.